Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another late show with Konstantinos Pappas. Welcome. It's 8 o'clock. We are here. It's Sunday, 17th May. Today we have a very interesting topic and a very interesting and knowledgeable guest. We are joined today by Dr. Jonathan Wright. Jonathan, welcome.
Hi there, Konstantinos. Very excited to be here. Well, a mixture of excitement and nerves. Is it okay to say that?
Yes, of course. Great. So we are live. Thank you for joining, for tuning in. Today's topic is the creative classroom, and we will talk about teaching creativity, imagination, and the industry realities, especially with a special focus on higher education in the UK. So, Jonathan, before we move on with our questions, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, I would. Well, as you know, my name is Jonathan Wright. I'm a program director at the London College of Communication. I run the Communication and Media program, which has got 7 degrees across the scope, 4 on the undergraduate, 2 on the postgraduate. I'm a film theorist, I suppose, by practice back in the day, 20 years ago when I sort of started. But more recently, I've become a bit more interested in ideas around pedagogy and the student experience, and that's been a main focus because of the shift in job I have from course leader, which is what Konstantinos is, to a PD. So yeah, that's a slightly rambling introduction, but yes.
Very good. Thank you very much. So shall we dive into our topic?
Yes.
So it's a great opportunity to have someone like you who combines the creative background with the creativity and how this creativity is being taught in the classroom, in the higher education, together with your management experience, of course. So I would like to ask you, first of all, when we talk about creativity in higher education, what are we actually talking about? What does this mean?
All right, that's a tough first question. I suppose the easy answer to that question, or the lame answer to that question, is that creativity means different things in different contexts within higher education. But that's a bit of a cop-out. When I talk to people about creativity, it's interesting. The first thing that comes to people's minds is skills. I want to be a better writer, a better sculptor, a better painter, or a better photographer. But I don't think that's creativity. That's creative output. Yeah, that's fine. That's a consequence of creativity, but it's not creativity in and of itself. And so what I tend to do with my students, and just to make it very clear, I don't have a creative background myself. I'm a sort of theoretician, but I work very closely with artists and creatives within the program. Our starting point is around ideation. Okay, where do ideas come from? How do we get an idea? How do we find something interesting to say about the world? And for me, this is a largely cognitive process. It's maybe an individual process, can be collaborative. I know some colleagues do mind mapping. From my own point of view, I tend to walk around the garden talking to myself. I don't think we can underestimate the value of talking to yourself as getting things through. But what we do with students, as well as talk in the more abstract about ideation, is to say, okay, where are you coming from? How do you know what you know? We don't sort of mention epistemology in that sort of deep way, but we think about frameworks of thinking. And then it's like, okay, well, where do your inspirations come from? Where do your ideas come from? Who do you rate? Who do you want to copy? Who do you want to parody? Who do you want to steal from? So for me, and this is a really narrow definition, but you asked me my opinion and I'm going to give it to you. is I think it essentially comes down to communication. And by that, I don't mean, effective communication, inverted commas. It can come in many different forms, but it comes down to communication. And ultimately, it's about, sort of storytelling, I suppose, talking about the world. And I think that's where we can start asking questions about, okay, is creativity about being original? Is there such a thing as originality? Is there such a thing as authenticity? Does creativity have to be connected to problem solving? And I think once you've done that mental gymnastics I've just described, I think from that flows the practicalities of the creative process. And that takes us back to the skills and questions around what resources do I need? What technologies do I need? Do I need to involve multimedia? Do I need to involve social media? Do I need to think about interactive or immersive media? So I think when we're talking about creativity in higher education, it's not a static thing. It's a set of psychological, social, cultural, economic, and practical processes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, yes, of course, creativity is such a vast concept, but the way that you summarized it, it actually puts the word creativity in perspective when we talk about the specific notion that you presented. So let me ask you, okay, you explained to us what is creativity according to you and how you see it being applied, but actually, is creativity something that can be genuinely taught? What do you think?
Wow, gosh, I get the answer to that has to be yes. Otherwise, we might as well just pack up and go home. So yeah, I have a bit of a bugbear. I get really nervous when people talk about, oh, someone's got a natural ability or aren't they kind of gifted? Because I'm not sure that's creativity. I mean, having skills is great. Okay, so being able to play the piano or knowing your way around Adobe Acrobat or Canva or Figma, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily make you a creative practitioner. It's a process. It doesn't determine whether or not you have something meaningful to say about the world or how you experience the world. And I think the process I talked about in the previous question around how creativity is a process, I'd say that it can be genuinely taught because it's about knowledge building. It's about being self-reflexive. It's about being a culturally aware practitioner. It's about knowing how you are in the world and how you engage with it. And this is a set of processes, practices. This is something that can be learned. I mean, I think of creativity as something that's like a kind of a cognitive muscle. It's not sort of fixed. It's something that needs nurturing. It needs love. It needs to be exposed to the right things. And I think if you come across someone who's willing to kind of engage in all that mental gymnastics, as I said again, and to sort of embrace, we talk about transformative education all the time, but I think if you're open to be transformed, then anyone can be creative and can find something interesting to sort of talk about. So yeah, I'm not suggesting that everyone's as able to be creative as everyone else, but what I'm saying that in the context of higher education, and I think it's interesting because I could argue that actually having a thought is just being creative. Having an original idea is just creative. You don't have to realize it in any way, shape, or form. But I suppose because we're talking about higher education, we are talking about student expectations, I do think we need to bear in mind that students sort of expect to have a thing in the world that they've produced. Again, it's a bit like that balance between, ideation, having an idea, thinking it through, and then how you realize it. And I think that process, that social cultural process, I think it's something that we can teach. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. Actually, the first part of your answer, it reminded me kind of this, a little bit old-fashioned opinion like creativity, you need to be talented, and if you don't have the talent, then, but you're actually right in the meaning that creativity can be a cognitive process. It can be something that you learn, that you exercise on, that you don't just rely on something ready, on something that is already there.
And we can draw from the work of Bourdieu in terms of his concept of the habitus. I mean, it's what you're exposed to as well, which shapes that ability to kind of express yourself in kind of creative ways. So there's a combination of different things, but I'm very much in favor, well, it's part of my job to be in favor of this, in favor of the idea that if you provide people with the right opportunities to engage with a range of different cultural forms, that adds to creativity. And one of the things we do in a course I run called, well, it was called Creative Foundations, but it's a course that introduces students in the first year to creativity. And one of the things that we've historically always done is expose students to a variety of different forms of film practice that they would never have been exposed. They might not have been exposed to before. And then back in the day, when I used to teach film, I taught a film theory course with a practitioner, and I did a one-off lecture on sort of surrealism, and it was remarkable each year the number of students who decided to use surrealist filmmaking because they hadn't never seen it before, and they produced these most fantastic kind of films based on the fact that I think they'd been exposed to something they didn't realize they could do before, that film doesn't have to make sense.
That's exactly my thought so many of the times. What do we expose our students to? And sometimes you have the anxiety of the teacher. Did I give enough stimuli? Did I give thorough tools? Did I equip my students enough? So I understand your point of view. So since you talk about students, I was wondering, do students sometimes misunderstand things or some notions about creativity when they first arrive at university? Because you talked also about a module that is taking place at the beginning of their studies, so they haven't been exposed yet. So do you see sometimes students arriving with certain misunderstandings about creativity?
Good question. I think the most common misunderstanding is unless you're in a studio with some tech, you're not being creative. And that goes back to the point I think I made before about, people's go-to response about, being creative is being able to do stuff, skills. And I think that that has actually been a real kind of issue on a number of courses within our program, that students will arrive and then, week 4, but we're not being creative yet. And we said, well, but you need to have something to say first. We need to kind of formulate an idea. So that's very common that it's all about the skills and the tech. But I think it is very important to frame that discussion around how you have an idea, and that's about managing student expectation. There's also another kind of dimension, I suppose, particularly if you teach in a university which has big film departments and screen departments. I suppose the work that you and I do, can we talk about this? Yeah, we can. The work that you and I do, Konstantinos, as the kind of course leader for public relations, we have kind of conversations about what creativity means in different contexts. And I think, if I was a film student, I'd have a certain set of expectations in relation to tech and creativity. But I think if I was a PR student, I'd have a different take on what being creative means. And so it's about managing student expectations. But in answer to your question, it's like, where's the studio? Where are the cameras? And if not that, we're not being creative. Whereas I'm a bit kind of left field. I tend to sort of say, well, writing an academic essay, that's what I call creativity, as well as visual practice. So I think it's about broadening people's understanding of what creativity can be. But it's an easy misunderstanding to kind of make, I suppose.
Yeah, I totally get your point of view. Yes, I have seen that sometimes also with students, that they think that just having a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper, this doesn't mean that you can be creative. Creativity requires fancy equipment and technical stuff and studios and whatever. But yeah, you're right.
And it also kind of goes back to, and I mean, I will try not to rant, but it also kind of goes back to the transactionality of higher education, that there is a price tag connected to the experience. And some students have tech and some don't. And or we have different technical requirements. And I think these conversations need to take place, but they're not easy.
Yes, you're right. So since you mentioned actually new students, undeniably we are living in an era shaped by social media, AI, digital culture, digitalization of communication, and all this stuff. So do you think, and if yes, up to what extent, that today's student, they understand creativity differently from previous generations? What's your take on that based on your experience?
God, that's a really tricky question.
Sorry, I put too many
No,
components
no,
in the
no, no,
question.
no, no. No, I think it's a lot of moving parts there, but let me think this through. So, I have a problem with this idea of someone's kind of gifted. I get kind of very cautious about fetishizing new forms of technology, AI, digital culture, media, social media. From my understanding of a non-technological determinist approach, is that technology tends to follow, culture, society. Technology produces a response to some social cultural need, and as a consequence of that, new forms of technology can, reproduce existing systems of inequality and power. So I would be very cautious about suggesting that new technology somehow means that what's happening today is actually brand new. I think what is important, and I can't help thinking of the work of David Harvey here. What is different, I suppose, in today's context is the incredible speed and intensity of the experiences facilitated, particularly by social media. I don't think we can underestimate the effectiveness of digital media. It's ubiquitous. It's such a big part of our life. And there's lots of work around, platformatization, the idea that, social media platforms have a logic which engages people in ways that mobilizes, the emotion or the feelings. We don't have rational debates anymore. We don't engage with culture we engage with culture in a more polemic way that's different from the ways in which more traditional forms of media transmit ideas. And obviously this comes along with a whole bunch of worries about disinformation and misinformation. I know it's an area of your speciality, Konstantinos. Reality distortion, gaslighting, etc. So I think to look back to your question in terms of how does this new context, provide us with some insight into how students engage with creativity differently, I'd say, yeah, okay. Thank you, Marshall McLuhan. Yes, the medium as the message, absolutely. But I would say that the kind of cultural reference points that one can find does include references to, dare I say, pre-digital culture. It might be just me, but on my Instagram account, I said I was a sort of film theorist, and it's been something I love for many years, and I think the algorithm knows that. I'm often getting feeds where it's saying, you couldn't possibly understand the cinematography of these current films without an appreciation of, I don't know, Roman Polanski's Chinatown.
So the algorithm definitely knows.
The algorithm. So what I would say is obviously the social media context, and AI I haven't touched on, and maybe I can get to that at some other point. I would say that students are engaging with media cultures in a slightly different way, but I don't think that we can say, oh, well, actually traditional forms of media and cultural reference points are dead. And actually, interesting enough, going back to my experiences of teaching a film theory course and practice course, the number of students who were way into, 90s Hollywood film as their cultural reference points, even though they exist in this sort of, we can't call it new media anymore, new media, digital media kind of culture. Exactly. I do think that I think the experience is perhaps different, but I think in terms of those creative reference points, history's not dead. And I think pre-digital culture still is alive and well and kicking. I think that is probably not an answer to your question, but it's partly what I wanted to say.
Okay, fair enough. I totally understand. Yes, you have a point there, to be honest. And sometimes it's kind of hard also to differentiate the exact impact of nowadays era with social media, digital
Mm,
culture, AI, with the differences that were happening. For example, what happened to creativity when internet came?
yeah.
That was another revolution for creativity. So
Yeah, I wonder, thinking back on what I've just said and what you've just said, I wonder whether or not there is a space to think about. I mean, please tell me if you disagree with my analysis here, but I do think that this sort of focus on, I think it's design thinking around, social media platforms that kind of go straight for the emotion. I was listening to a colleague the other day talking about her research, and she talked about the way in which we're sort of trapped in this toxic relationship that we keep on scrolling and it keeps appealing to our emotions and we can't get away from that. Whether or not that focus on emotions and feelings rather than um, various forms of the Nouvelle Vague were very highly intellectual forms of culture, which required a certain amount of sort of thinking about the medium itself and what is storytelling. I don't know. Perhaps some of that nuance gets lost. I really don't have I don't have a clear answer to that question because it's tricky. But I think we could have an entire show just on this question.
yeah, I think this could be a topic for another show, and we
Yeah,
could just dedicate a whole hour just to this.
yeah.
Okay, so before we move on to our next question, let me invite you and our listeners to a message from our sponsors, which will be accompanied from the news, from the Teachers Talk radio news for this week. So stay tuned, and we will be back in about 4 minutes.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week says internal exclusions may not lead to fewer suspensions from school. Analysis by the Education Policy Institute of 3 London council areas found tentative correlations between the use of internal exclusions and rates of suspensions. It comes as the DFE plans to share new guidance with schools to encourage head teachers to only send pupils home for the most serious cases of poor behaviour and violence, aiming to reduce lost learning time. The researchers said findings should be treated with caution due to small sample sizes, but analysis found that higher levels of internal exclusions are associated with both higher frequencies and rates of suspensions, suggesting that internal exclusion as currently used in these schools does not appear to function as an alternate measure to suspension. Full story on Schools Week. CES Magazine says schools face an unrealistic deadline to implement new safeguarding proposals. The consultation on updates to keeping children safe in education concluded on the 22nd of April, but DSLs say the changes mark a significant overhaul and inadequate time has been left for implementation. The concerns largely lay with new guidance around children questioning their gender identity. Other issues raised include guidance around toilets, use of generative AI, and ensuring robust cover for when a DSL is unavailable. For more details, comments from leaders and union reps, and response from the Department for Education, see TES Magazine. Schools Week reports that ministers should strengthen their oversight of school sixth form expansion to ensure the presence of too many small settings isn't undermining efficiency and sufficiency in post-16 provision. The advice comes following research by NFER, focused on exam entries per provider. The figures were used to analyse subject ranges on offer and determine class sizes. 23 cold spots were identified in the report and details of subjects not offered in certain areas. Core subjects such as history, geography and sociology A-levels were offered in most areas, but subjects like music, technology and dance were missing in over 70 areas, whilst A-level German was unavailable in 31 areas. Cold spots range from big cities to more rural areas. More details and recommendations in the article can be found on Schools Week. Finally, Geo News in Karachi reports the exam board CIE has postponed A-level maths exams after a leak of an AS level mathematics paper. In a statement, CIE confirmed that the paper was shared prematurely, against its strict regulations. The statement went on to say that the CIE would share further detailed information regarding next steps by the 22nd of May, but that following discussions with stakeholders in Pakistan, it had decided to postpone the A-level paper as an additional security measure. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back, everyone. We are here in our show with Dr. Jonathan Wright, and our topic is on the creative classroom. And Jonathan, we were just talking about the impact of social media, digitalization, and AI on creativity, and how this can be perceived by students as an impactful difference, let's say, compared to previous generations. So let me ask you, let's say in practical terms, what does a creative classroom actually look like? I mean, you talked a little bit about that sometimes students, they have this expectation of a sophisticated studio, but what makes a creative classroom, or what actually looks like a creative classroom according to you?
These questions aren't getting any harder. I'll get it easier, sorry, isn't it? Gosh, what a very good question. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a really good question, actually. You know, you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? What do you actually do in the classroom? A good question. I would say I would go back to the kind of principle or the process I mentioned before. So I would say that in the classroom, the best way to approach creativity is to illustrate that process from ideation to having an idea, developing that concept and realizing it as a creative output. I think I said before, I think in higher education, I think that creative output is really important, and we can have a separate conversation about what that is. So it's an activity that helps students make a connection between the thinking and the generating of an output. Actually, I've got an example. Again, from my Creative Foundations course, one of my fantastic writing tutors came up with an amazing writing task, which I hope you agree it is, otherwise it's going to fall flat. We get students as a writing task. They make a statement about what do you stand for, like a manifesto. But what Claire does is say you can only have between 7 or 8 words. I think it's, it has to like appear on a doormat or a flyer. So I think all creative practice is given shape by the things you can't do as well as the things you can do. So I think in the seminar, there were some examples of how other people did that. And then the students would sort of brainstorm as to what kind of statements they would want to make about their sense of self in the world. That obviously fits in with the 7 to 8 words. And then these students were given something like 20 minutes to go away and come up with a whole plethora of manifestos. And then as they were presenting them, the tutor would say, okay, well, can you now tell me why you came to this output and what role did the constraints play? There are probably better examples I could kind of come up with, but that's the one thing that sort of jumps to mind, and it illustrates what I said before, that it provides students with an opportunity to do that journey, that creative journey, from having an idea to producing a thing in the world.
That actually sounds very coherent, and it even helped me understand even better. I mean, the way that you explained that you need to illustrate from the ideation to the final result, and through that example, actually, it totally makes sense. Yes, it's a brilliant example. So, building on that, can I ask if you can identify some teaching approaches that encourage creativity?
Well, in terms of, I mean, a little bit kind of along the lines of how this takes place within the seminar. So it's bespoke, hands-on. I mean, I know I'm contradicting myself here, saying it's not all about the skill set, but the skill set does help speak to the student in terms of how that kind of approaches. So I think these kind of teaching approaches where you have seminar-based discussions that come off the back of a more general principle discussion. So, for example, in relation to, we teach film and television, no, not film and television, film and video as a kind of creative asset. So my fantastic colleague, Toby, will do an amazing lecture on the nuts and bolts of cinema language, film language. But then what we do in the seminars is take some of those principles and give students an opportunity to do that in a very similar task, which starts from ideation and ends up with them producing a very small piece of film. So yeah, I suppose the thing I didn't mention in relation to the previous example is that all these tasks need to be framed around much broader conversations about how creativity works, and also a kind of instruction of how a particular skill set works.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, since you talked about the creative environment in a classroom, I assume there must be times that some students or even many students might feel afraid of failure or getting it wrong, let's say. So, how do you feel? What's your take on creating an environment that students will feel safe in that? To experiment, to take creative risks, to express themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting enough, I'm going to go off on a tangent. Interesting enough, my son is doing his GCSEs, and we're looking for where he'd want to go to do his A-levels. And we were scouting around schools, and we went to one particular school, which kind of progressive. And on the tour, as we were walking around, I think it was outside the art room, there was this big poster by the door with a very simple message saying, "Failure is part of learning." On the one hand, that might be slightly off-putting, but on the other hand, I thought, wow, what a brave thing to say to potentially 15, 16-year-olds. Actually, you're going to have to, get hurt to, you've been told you get it wrong in order to get it right. So one of the things I was thinking about, going back to what do we do in the classroom rather than me talking esoterically about things, it is something that we've thought about, and it's certainly something that we've had feedback from students about. It's very difficult. And so one of the things I think is very important is to embed ideas around resilience into the curriculum. How do you deal with rejection, which is a part of life? It's a part of professional life and personal life. There can be no success without failure. We're not marking you, we're marking your work. And this is something that I'm particularly interested in my own area or field of research. Back in, I think it was 2020, I kind of came across this idea of a safe space within the classroom, which is the idea that classroom spaces should be inclusive and, people should be protected from psychological and emotional harm. The kind of problem with safe spaces is, firstly, it's a bit misleading because you can't do that. You can't promise that anyway. But it's also kind of counterproductive because it promises to protect you from the one thing you need in order to grow and learn. Learning is messy. It is difficult. And so one of the concepts that I've written about and talked at length about in both this context of my job and also my research is this concept of the brave space, which comes out of the safe space, which is the idea that you have a space where you can manage conflict. So you have, courage to take on the difficultness of learning and confronting other people with different opinions, but knowing that there's going to be support there, and it's kind of acknowledged. So to go back to your question, because I will answer your question, I would say therefore that the manufacturing or creating of brave spaces helps provide a framework for taking risks and potentially failing. How would you do that? I'm sorry, I'm preempting your follow-on question because I've just given you a very esoteric answer.
Well, sorry, yes.
No, I would say I'm just thinking about that. I've had a number of members of staff who've looked at this very, very well. One example I can give is a very simple one whereby at the beginning of each session, the tutor would put up onto a PowerPoint slide a kind of not learning contract, but an agreement about how we communicate and the importance of respect. It's something as simple as that sets the tone for the conversation. But there are a number of ways of doing that.
That's actually, I want to focus a little bit on what you said, that failure is a part of the learning process, and in the sense that we can never guarantee that the learning process will be smooth and safe, and everybody will understand the same things at the same time. So failure can be part of the process, and congratulations that you failed. You have learned something. But you actually, also, yes.
Sorry, I'm not one to rant, as you know, Konstantinos. I'm a very sane person. But there is a broader context to this. There are structural obstacles in the way of doing this stuff within higher education, which I think is being framed increasingly more around the Montessorization of education, which means our relationship with students becomes increasingly more transactional. I'm not saying this is our everyday experience, but that institutional sector-wide context. I had a student once who said, I worked out how much it costs for me to pay for one of your lectures and you ended 3 minutes early. And I think, well, that's not quite the way you think about it. But this broader context does make it very difficult not to try to create an environment that's centered around satisfaction, student happiness, and a culture of affirmation. And I think this is, I haven't got a solution to this, but I would argue that this broader context is really counterproductive when we try and create kind of brave spaces. Sorry, I did promise not to rant, and just sort of realized I have. But I think it has to be said that the obstacles that we encounter and the issues that we have, where students say, "Well, yeah, I'm paying for this experience. How dare you tell me I'm not creative enough?" There's a context to that, and it's tough on course teams. Anyway, I sound like an old man.
You helped me a lot, because in my mind, I wanted to ask you something about that you already started talking about. How do universities, with all these very clear instructions and outcomes and learning outcomes, grading systems, assessment criteria, where do you find the balance between structure and freedom in creative education? And do you think that sometimes universities, they standardize creativity, even unintentionally?
No, I think some universities intentionally standardize creativity because it makes life a lot easier. To go back to you mentioned about a kind of a balance, and I think it's a really important kind of question. We have students who want to learn by numbers. That some students are very instrumental, and that's fine. It's an economic investment, and they want to know how to get the best mark. So I think there are two things that we can. I think the two things that we can do in terms of how we teach creativity. On the one hand, there are certain things that we can talk about it, not in black and white terms, but to go back to my example of film and video, my fantastic colleagues, there are things within mainstream narrative cinema which you can kind of explain. The one how you can HG rule, framing, editing, all that kind of stuff. So there are certain things that we can provide students which are very structured and very straightforward, and can be fitted into an assessment criteria, a learning outcome, or a grade. But we can't prescribe what that story is going to be. We can't govern students' inspiration. We can't tell them how to make the adaptations or how to be kind of original and authentic. And this reminds me of a conversation I had with a prospective PhD student some years ago who wanted to do a practice-based PhD, and we were talking about their ideas and stuff. And it rapidly became apparent that doing a PhD wasn't necessarily going to make them a better artist. And partly of the ways in which education is framed around assessment criteria, learning outcomes, and grading systems. And I'm not suggesting we should necessarily do away with that, because in my experience, the more clear you are in terms of how you're going to assess something, the more the students appreciate that clarity. And it speaks to a form of instrumentalism. Fair enough, fine. But I think it's quite good to be able to explain to a student how they can succeed in their learning. So again, I think it's about a balance. It's about a balance between having a structure that fits in with learning outcomes and grading benchmarks and stuff, which we know students like, and also designing. And I think the key here is a clever assessment brief, is having wording within the assessment brief that gives that little bit of flex for students to take their own direction, and also provides the student, so the staff rather, and the student, but the staff in particular, an opportunity to exercise their academic judgment to let that happen, but also let the staff, in terms of feedback, provide, how to put it, some kind of recognition that's meaningful to the students. Yes. Sorry, was that?
No, I totally understand. And actually, you are very right that you need some kind of a social contract, let's say, between the teacher and the student, where the more things can be explained while maintaining the balance of leaving some things intentionally unexplained in order not to prevent creativity and the limit of imagination. That's a very careful balance that you need to have.
I can give an example of where I had a difficult learning experience. When I'll go back to, I do teach other things other than this one unit, but just seems to sort of stay very well.
I know, but you feel emotionally connected.
Yeah, I know. It's been 5 or 6 years since when we first launched the unit that I have mentioned before, in terms of the assessment, we thought, okay, students weren't very clear, and they had a task to produce a creative practice around a borough in London. Also helps with that transition to higher education, and lots of students who are new to London, blah, blah, blah. Sounded like a really great idea. Students came back saying, oh, no, we don't like this. We don't want to do something on a borough. We want to be able to create it. We want to be able to sort of talk about experiences of the world. And so, okay, that's absolutely fine. Good. That's a great lesson to learn. Next year, we broadened it out around identity politics. Feedback we got, we just don't want something so broad. We want something more clear. So it's really difficult to kind of sort of sit that balance, because sometimes choice is not welcomed. Sometimes they want a kind of clear sort of steering direction. And I do think, Konstantinos, I have focused slightly a lot on the undergraduate experience. And I think when we're talking about postgraduate students, there's a different set of parameters. But I'm not quite sure we've got enough time in the show for me to digress into the postgraduate experience as well. But
that will be our third show, Jonathan.
That'll be the third show, yes. How many Sundays are we planning?
No, don't worry. We can be here forever. Okay. So let me feed on what you just said and build on it. because you briefly touched on it. I mean, yes, we understand the balance, how difficult this can be, especially when it comes to providing feedback. Okay, so how do you approach feedback in some ways that challenge students, but without discouraging them? Because, creative work can feel very personal to
Yeah.
students.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
what do you think about that?
This is a topic of conversation with students we have a lot, and it's partly about we're assessing the work, not the person, and it goes, I suppose, to this idea of building in strategies of resilience within the curriculum. And I'm not saying that we're there, but it's certainly something that I think we need to develop. I'm sorry, I'm talking about our own practice, but I think something that we can develop a lot more within the process. I think, and this is a bit cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway, I think one of the ways of providing students with challenging feedback and not putting them off is you have to feed forward. You have to provide a way forward of saying, okay, maybe this isn't going as well as we thought, or well as you thought. However, this is the way in which you can develop your work. This is a way in which you can sort of realize your potential. Yeah, that's a way
I
of
couldn't agree more. Yes. Otherwise, it feels like criticism. It's like you criticize and you say, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. But once this is taken and given in a way that can feed forward to their work, to their academic journey, then things are getting much clearer and much softer, but also very rewarding and educational in the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing.
Again,
so,
it's
yes.
about, sorry, it's about that. I keep talking about balance. Maybe this is the theme of the show. Balance between one thing and another.
Maybe we should have renamed the topic as balance in creativity in higher education. Okay, that's an idea for the next show as well. Just a very brief break to hear from our sponsor, Hachette Learning, and we will be back in some seconds.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
So, Jonathan, for the last part of this show, I would like to take you to another topic, again exploring creativity, but from the perspective of employability this time. There's an increasing focus on industry-ready graduates. Has this changed the way creativity is taught in higher education?
Oh, God, I'm sorry, but I really cringe when people talk about industry ready or industry fit. I mean, what? Ready for what? To fit in?
Sorry for the wording. I mean,
no.
Let's say
no. No, you're a victim of my pedantry. Don't worry. I just have a like industry fit. I mean, we talk about the transformative nature of higher education, and that you are the future of the medium creative industries, and then we talk about kind of industry ready or industry fit. I mean, fit. I hope to transform the industry anyway. But you're quite right, and as we both know, employability has become increasingly more important. From my perspective, the last sort of 10 to 15 years, employability has become increasingly more important to be embedded within the curriculum of undergraduate and postgraduate study. And I don't think we can get away from that. And goes back to my mention about the monetarization of higher education. Obviously, students are thinking, well, if I invest in my education, what job am I going to get? And so we're going to get rid of employability. So let's get that out of the way. In terms of creativity, I think, we probably can get some benchmarks about what creative practice looks like by having a look at what's happening in the industry. And given that students want to work in that industry, that makes a certain amount of sense. But what I would say, and this is about industry graduates, What I would say is whenever on guest speaker talks years ago, and the industry partners I talk to now, the one thing that seems to come out from these conversations that seems to be quite sustained is, so yeah, we've got we've got graduates who are really great in tech, but God's sake, they've got nothing to say. What's their intervention? And I think to square that circle, that testimony speaks to the principles of creativity I mentioned before. And I think okay, fine, there's a skill set there, but we need to kind of go back to, and I sound like I'm banging on the same drum here, but I think we need to kind of go back to creativity as process. And I think we need to talk about, not be afraid to talk. Yes, we need to think about the epistemological framing of creative thought, forms of thought, and that, that thing of what are you going to say that's so interesting that is going to command my time for me to watch your video? And I'm very unpopular in some respects when I come down to that. So why is what you're producing worthy of my attention? Which, probably sounds a bit arrogant, but that's how I would say. So industry ready graduates, yes, absolutely, but creativity has to be around interventions.
Now you really challenge me with what you said about the creative thinking, and I am a strong believer in the development of the critical thinking. I mean, whenever we hear about these industry ready graduates and employability should be the main focus and all this, yes, but don't necessarily search to monetize your higher education through finding a job, but focus on the access to resources, on the access to opportunities to develop your critical thinking. And as you said, of course, again, and very fairly, the development of creative thinking, because we are talking about the creative industries in any case. But that's a topic again,
Another Sunday.
Exactly. So since we talk about the impacts and how the focus on employability can affect the ways creativity is taught, can I ask you about the AI conversations, around creativity in education? Do you think we are entering a period where creativity itself, it really needs to be redefined because of AI, all thanks to AI?
Finally, we're talking about the elephant in the room.
Yes. It was time.
Well, I think as a sector, higher education is a little bit late to the game here, and I'm quite glad that the current conversations have shifted away from AI as being a source of anxiety. However, having said that, I've run open days where there's been questions, often from parents, saying, "What are you going to do about AI stealing all the jobs?" So I'm quite glad that we've moved away from AI in that anxious way. I'm very glad that we've moved away from a conversation of, you and I are old enough to remember this, but this sort of 80s just say no prohibition approach to AI, that one shouldn't engage with it because it's evil and unethical. Although there is a strong argument, which I don't think is taking place at the moment, as broadly as it could be, about the environmental impact of artificial intelligence and whether or not we should boycott it, but that's a different question. So I think what in terms of AI and in relation to creativity and the conversations that I've been having in education, it's about a frank conversation about the pros and cons. Again, to go back to teaching students about creativity in the first year, we talk about AI. We say, listen, if you engage with AI to do X, Y, and Z, you are robbing yourself of a learning experience. So don't use AI, please, and learn those skills afresh. And what we're developing, I suppose, and this relates to how we think about AI and whether or not creativity is redefined. One of the things that we're working on, and other universities doing the same thing, is like a traffic light system. So there are units where you can't use AI, please, because you're robbing yourself of a learning opportunity. There are units whereby you can use AI, but make sure you make it very clear the role it's played. And thirdly, you have to use AI because it's part of the curriculum. And so that I think is where we're at. And I have to say, there are many conversations, partly from my colleagues in the advertising, but I'm sure it's relevant to public relations as well, where certainly teaching students how to become effective prompts for AI is becoming an established sort of new skill. But the one thing I think, in terms of creativity, the one thing I think often say, and you may not agree with this, is that the best that AI can do is mediocrity. The best it can do is just produce variations of stuff that's already out there. It's not gonna, I don't think it can kill that human creativity, but I realize I've just said something that could be a third or fourth show now, because that's such a big topic. But I do think that it is changing in the conversations. But I would also refer back to something I've already said. I think those cultural reference points that I'm sort of familiar with, they still have kind of currency.
Well, I particularly enjoyed what you said, and for sure, believe me, I will be using it from now on. This appeal to guilt that you mentioned, like if you want to use AI, you are just depriving yourself from the wonderful development of such and such skill, which, kind of redefines the importance of AI, especially when it comes to creativity.
Sure.
So, we only have a little bit more than 4 minutes, and it's time for my last question to you, Jonathan. After all these questions, after all this discussion, what gives you hope about the future of creative education today?
You, Konstantinos. You.
Oh, okay.
No, my colleagues, I have to say, I've been around. I mean, those of you who can see my avatar, I've been around a long time. I've been teaching for about 25 years, and I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I've had such an amazing team around me of, no longer, I used to be the youngest person in the room, no longer is that the case, of various different people from various different backgrounds all kind of coming together, and the sheer passion and enthusiasm I have encountered from my student, from my colleagues right across the program and across the university, that gives me hope, because there's lots of people I know who could be doing other things not within education, but they've decided to come and infuse and inspire our students. They've come from industry, they've come from various different places, but they have a really kind of clear kind of purpose. And so that gives me a huge amount of hope, alongside many of the great students we have as well. I mean, one of the things that I do as part of who I am, about 25% of who I am, I'm a University College Union branch secretary, I'm a health and safety rep, I'm a treasurer. And in UCU, we have this new slogan that's come out saying that we are the university. And that really does resonate with me, because yes, of all the problems that I've outlined in this conversation and all the bits of rant I've kind of thrown at you, I do actually at the end of the day have a lot of faith in terms of the people coming into higher education and what they can offer. And as long as that passion and enthusiasm continues, I will remain a very happy man.
You know what, Jonathan? I couldn't think of a better way. I couldn't expect of a nicer way to end this beautiful discussion. You're so right. I mean, it all comes down to human relationships, to the cross-fertilization of ideas, especially when it comes to creative education that we so much need today.
Yeah.
So that was all.
Wow.
I can't thank you enough. I mean, this hour just passed without even realizing.
It's just flown by. I have to say.
Exactly. If you ask me, it is still 8 o'clock or something.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that people listening to this have as much fun as we have listening to our conversation.
I do hope so.
Let's reserve judgment.
I do hope so. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for being here, for joining us today for this very interesting, amazing, brilliant conversation. Thank you to all our listeners for listening live. Don't forget that you can listen to us at any time you want on YouTube, on X, on LinkedIn. You can find our links on all the social media platforms of Teachers Talk Radio. See you in our next show. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for being here today.
No, I've had a ball. Thank you so much, Konstantinos. It's been great to have a conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Have a good night, everyone.
Night.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.